Hey there, future civil servants. It's February 6th, 2025. Back again with your daily dose of UPSC Current Affairs. Ready for a deep dive into some topics that'll hit both GS Paper 2 and 3.
Absolutely. We've got a lot to unpack today. The Election Commission's neutrality is being questioned. There's the latest Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, and even the Jevons Paradox.
Okay, so let's jump right in with the Election Commission of India, the ECI. They're facing some serious heat over allegations of bias. We've seen these concerns before, but things like the Delhi 2025 elections really brought it all to a head.
Yeah, you're right. These accusations have been around for a while. It's interesting, though, how they kind of overlap with these recent changes. Like, the Supreme Court changed how election commissioners are appointed. They're aiming for more impartiality. Now, a committee picks them, and it's got the prime minister, the leader of the opposition, and a union cabinet minister.
But even with that change, critics are still skeptical. They point to stuff like those promises of tax breaks during campaigns, like what happened in Delhi. And they're saying certain appointments still look politically motivated.
Yeah, it definitely makes you wonder if the changes are enough to make sure the ECI is really neutral. Take the Assam delimitation, for example. Redrawing those electoral boundaries, some people are saying it was done to help the ruling party.
It is tricky, though. The ECI insists it's neutral, right? They point to their constitutional autonomy and the fact that decisions are made by a three-member group. Plus, they say they're trying to be more transparent with voter awareness programs and using things like EVMs and those digital voter IDs.
Right, those are important points. It shows they're trying. But for you, thinking about the UPSC exam, think about this. What does this whole debate tell us about the challenges our democratic institutions are facing? And what kind of reforms do we need to make sure elections are free and fair?
Good point. It's not just memorizing facts. It's about understanding what's really going on. Okay, let's move on to the economy. The latest Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, or HCES, is out for 2023-24. It's full of interesting stuff.
Absolutely. The survey's super important. It gives us a close look at how households in India are spending their money. This data is like gold. It's used for economic planning, figuring out poverty levels, and even updating the Consumer Price Index.
And the report shows some positive things, like monthly per capita expenditure, or MPCE, is going up in both rural and urban areas. Plus, that gap between urban and rural consumption is getting smaller.
Exactly. And some states are doing really well. Odisha, for example, had a huge jump in rural MPCE, like 14%. In Kerala, they have a really small urban-rural gap, just 18%. That tells you something about what's happening in different parts of the country economically.
There are definitely still problems, though. The report says that the overall urban-rural gap is still there, and some states, like Maharashtra and Karnataka, aren't seeing much MPCE growth.
It raises a big question for policymakers. How do we make sure economic growth includes everyone, that it benefits all regions and all parts of society? That's something to think about when you look at this HCES data.
Okay, let's switch from the economy to something environmental. A new report says something pretty shocking. Over 100 glaciers have just disappeared in Arunachal Pradesh in the last 30 years.
That's right. And the total area covered by glaciers has shrunk by a lot, something like 309 square kilometers. It's a serious wake-up call about what climate change is doing to the Himalayas.
What's causing this? Is it just global warming? What's making these glaciers melt so fast?
Global temperatures going up are a big part of it, that's for sure, all those carbon emissions. But it's not just that. Changes in rain and snowfall are also playing a role. There's more rain now instead of snow, and that makes the melting happen faster.
So it's like a combination of global and local factors. But what does it mean for us? What are the bigger implications if these glaciers keep disappearing?
This is where it gets really important for the UPSC exam. Think about the impact on things like our water resources, disaster management, even national security. Remember, those Himalayan glaciers feed huge rivers like the Brahmaputra, and millions of people depend on them.
It makes you think. Disappearing glaciers could mean not enough water and a bigger risk of those glacial lake outburst floods. Important stuff for both GS Paper 1 and 3.
Absolutely. Okay, ready for a change of pace? Let's talk about something that sounds a bit strange. The Jevons Paradox.
This is where things get interesting. Remember DeepSeek AI, that new AI platform everyone's talking about? When they launched, it actually caused tech stocks to drop all over the world. People got worried about the demand for AI chips.
And that reaction, that's the Jevons Paradox in action. It's named after an economist, William Stanley Jevons. Basically what it says is that when a resource becomes more efficient, cheaper to use, people often end up using more of it, not less.
So even though DeepSeek AI is more efficient, if everyone starts using it, we might actually need more AI chips.
Exactly. That's the paradox. And this idea applies to more than just AI. Think about energy efficiency or even healthcare. Technology improves, things get more efficient, but then we often end up using more of them.
Fascinating. Definitely something to think about when you're prepping for the UPSC exam.
For sure. Okay, let's do a quick run through of some other important current affairs you should know about.
Hit me with it. I'm ready for a quick knowledge boost.
First up, USAA. That's the United States Agency for International Development. There's been a lot of talk about whether it might shut down under the Trump administration and what that would mean for India's development programs, especially in areas like health and climate.
Okay, yeah, I remember that. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Now, what about beggar-thy-neighbor policies? I always get mixed up with that term.
Think of it this way. One country tries to help its own economy by hurting other countries' economies, often using things like tariffs or by messing with their currency. It's an old idea that's becoming relevant again.
Right, right. It reminds you that global economics can be a pretty rough game.
Now, let's see what you know about India's national symbols, specifically the state emblem. The Union Home Ministry sent out a reminder to all the states about how it should be shown.
Ah, yeah, the Sarnath lion, capital of Ashoka. Such a cool image. What was the reminder about?
It has to include the motto Satyameva Jayate, and it has to be in Devanagari script. Knowing these details about our national symbols is important, not just for prelims, but also for understanding what they mean to us.
Okay, what's next?
Here's something good for the cooperative sector.
Hmm.
India is getting its first national cooperative university. It's going to be called the Tribhuvan Sakari University, and it's going to be at IRMA, the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, in Gujarat.
Wow, that's a big deal. IRMA is a great institution. This new university will make its role in the cooperative movement even stronger.
Exactly. And our last quick fact. Let's go to Santorini Island in Greece.
Wait, is that the island with those white houses and blue roofs? Why is it in the news?
Well, they've put it on high alert because there's been a bunch of earthquakes under the sea. Santorini is right on top of a super active volcano in the Aegean Sea. So all those earthquakes are a reminder of how powerful that area is.
Wow, that's a lot. We've gone from global politics and economics to the environment and geography. That was a pretty intense rapid-fire round.
We definitely covered a lot. But before we move on, I want to mention one more thing that's happening in the economy. India is shifting to using the debt-to-GDP ratio as its main fiscal anchor.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that before. Can you explain that a bit more? What does it mean?
Basically, starting in the fiscal year 2026-27, India is going to focus more on the debt-to-GDP ratio than the fiscal deficit as the main indicator of how healthy its finances are.
I see. So why is that a big change?
It shows that they're thinking long-term about keeping things stable and managing debt properly. The government wants to get the debt-to-GDP ratio to 50%, give or take 1% by 2031.
Sounds like a big goal.
It is ambitious, but it brings India's fiscal strategy in line with what other countries are doing, which is a good thing. Now, there are some things to keep in mind about the debt-to-GDP ratio, and we'll go into those a bit more in a minute.
Okay, sounds good. Why don't we take a quick break and then come back to talk more about this debt-to-GDP ratio? Welcome back, everyone. We were just talking about India deciding to use the debt-to-GDP ratio as its main way of measuring its finances.
Yeah, you were saying that it's not as simple as just looking at that ratio and saying, lower debt, better country, right?
Right, exactly. It's kind of like, judging a company only by how much money it's making without looking at its costs or how it's using its profits. A low debt-to-GDP ratio might seem good at first glance, but it doesn't tell you if they're using that borrowed money to invest in things that'll help the economy grow later on.
So a country could have what looks like a good ratio, but still be messing up their finances. Maybe they're borrowing money for things that don't actually benefit the economy, or maybe they're not spending enough on important stuff like education or healthcare. Exactly. And the ratio doesn't tell you anything about the government's overall strategy, their fiscal policy. Are they being careful with spending, or are they just spending like crazy, which could cause problems down the road? The ratio itself can't answer those questions.
That's a good reminder to think critically, right? Now just look at the numbers on the surface. This is important for anyone studying for the UPSC. You have to analyze economic indicators carefully, considering the context and understanding what they can't tell you.
Totally agree. The debt-to-GDP ratio is a useful tool, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. You also need to look at things like the types of debt, how well the government is spending its money, and the overall economic situation.
Okay, I get it. Now, can we go back to the Election Commission of India for a sec? We talked about the accusations of bias, but what can be done to make them more transparent and accountable? Seems pretty relevant for GS paper 2, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you're right on the money with that. Experts have a few ideas about reforms that could make the ECI stronger and build more trust with the public. One big one is reforming electoral finance.
Right, because how campaigns are funded is kind of a black box now, isn't it? It makes it easy for corruption and for people to buy influence.
Exactly. If there were stricter rules about disclosing political donations, it would make things fairer and help make sure that elections are decided by the people, not by whoever has the most money to throw around.
And there's that Model Code of Conduct, the MCC.
Yeah.
It's supposed to make sure campaigns are run ethically. But we see people break the rules all the time, and they don't really get punished for it. Or the punishment is just a slap on the wrist.
Making the MCC stronger is super important. Imagine you're a district magistrate trying to enforce those rules during an election. If you had clear guidelines, ways to track things in real time, and tougher penalties, you could actually make sure things were fair.
Makes sense. And of course, we can't forget about public awareness and making sure voters are educated. An informed electorate is what makes a healthy democracy, right?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, back to economics. Let's think about what this Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, the HCES, means for policy. It's got a lot of good data that can help policymakers figure out how to fix some of the problems we've been talking about.
One thing we learned is that even though the gap between urban and rural consumption is getting smaller, it's still pretty big. We need policies that'll help rural economies grow.
Right. Think about it this way. Let's say you're an IAS officer working in a rural district. You could use the HCES data to see what that district needs and what opportunities there are. Maybe you focus on creating jobs, improving infrastructure, or making sure there's good internet access to bridge that gap.
And we have to do something about the differences between states, too. Some of them are falling behind when it comes to MPCE growth.
Yeah.
It's a sign that their economies aren't doing so well.
Definitely. You can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach. We need solutions that are tailored to each state's specific needs and challenges.
Another interesting thing the ACES shows is that people are spending more on things they don't necessarily need while they're spending less on basic food grains.
That's true, and it's a bit worrying. We have to make sure that people are getting the nutrition they need and that their consumption habits are sustainable in the long run. Economic growth shouldn't mean sacrificing health and well-being.
So thinking about the future, we need to figure out how to encourage people to spend money on essential things, on healthcare, and on saving for the future.
Exactly. And one more thing the HCES reminds us of is that we still need strong social welfare programs. Even with all the progress we've made, vulnerable groups like scheduled tribes and scheduled castes are still facing a lot of economic inequality.
Expanding programs like direct benefit transfers, rural livelihood missions, and other targeted interventions is key to reducing that inequality and making sure that everyone benefits from economic growth.
Couldn't agree more. Now let's go back to those disappearing glaciers in Arunachal Pradesh. Remember, it's not just about the ice melting. It affects our water resources, disaster management, and even national security.
Right. It shows how everything's connected, how a change in one area can have a domino effect on other areas.
Yeah.
It's not just an environmental problem, it's a social problem, an economic problem, and even a geopolitical problem.
Exactly. And the possibility of conflict over dwindling water resources is something that future diplomats and security analysts really need to think about.
It's a complex problem with serious consequences. Before we move on to our last segment, though, let's go back to that Jevons Paradox. We talked about how it applies to things like energy and AI, but you asked us to think about how it shows up in other parts of our lives, too.
That's right. I want you to think about how the Jevons Paradox might be playing out in healthcare.
Okay, interesting. I can see how all the advancements in medical technology have led to more effective treatments and people living longer. But could that also be part of why healthcare costs are going up and why there's more demand for medical services?
Exactly. As healthcare becomes more advanced and easier to get, it also becomes more expensive and more people want it, which could lead to a situation where costs and demand just keep going up and up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I bet the same logic applies to other areas, like transportation. Just because we have faster, more efficient cars doesn't mean there's less traffic or that people are using less fuel.
You got it. It often leads to people driving farther and more often, which contributes to cities spreading out and causing environmental problems. The Jevons Paradox really shows how complicated it is, Technology advances, human behavior changes, and then there are all these unintended consequences.
So even when we're trying to do good things, like make things more efficient and make progress, we have to be aware of the potential downsides.
You said it perfectly. It's a super important concept for anyone who wants to work in policy or just understand the problems our world is facing today.
This has been a really thought-provoking discussion. I feel like we've covered so much ground. But there's still a couple more important points I want to touch on, particularly about national symbols and that new cooperative university.
You're right. We should definitely talk more about those. Let's go back to those topics in our final segment and wrap things up.
All right, we're back. For this last part of our deep dive, I want to make sure we touch on those two things we mentioned before. India State Emblem and that new cooperative university.
Yeah, good idea. Let's give those a bit more attention. We can start with that state emblem. The Union Home Ministry sent out that reminder, right, about showing it correctly. It's a good reminder of how important those national symbols are.
Yeah, it might seem like a small thing, but it really says a lot about our history and what we value. Every time I see that Sarnath lion, capital of Ashoka, with the Satyameva Jayati underneath, I get this, feeling of pride.
It's a strong symbol of India's past, for sure. And that motto, truth alone triumphs, it really captures what India is all about. For those of you prepping for the UPSC, understanding stuff like this goes beyond just memorizing facts.
Oh, for sure. It's about getting that deeper meaning, seeing how it reflects what India is. All right, let's switch gears and talk about that new cooperative university. It's a pretty exciting development.
Yeah, the Tribhuvan Sakari University, they're putting it at IRMA in Anand, Gujarat. It's a big step for the cooperative movement in India.
It shows how committed the government is to making cooperatives stronger. They're really recognizing how important they are, especially for rural development, financial inclusion, and helping those marginalized communities.
Think about the impact this university could have. I mean, it's going to be a center for research, for new ideas, for training people. A whole new generation of leaders for the cooperative movement could come from this.
It's a great way to honor people like Verghese Kurian, the guy behind India's White Revolution. He was all about cooperatives, and he founded IRMA.
He was such an inspiration, and this university will build on everything he did. It'll help shape the future of cooperatives all over India.
It's really great to see things like this happening. Okay, so big picture. We've talked about a lot today. The Election Commission, all those economic indicators, the impact of climate change, even that mind-bending Jevons Paradox.
We really have. We've explored some tough issues, analyzed policies, and hopefully got you thinking in some new ways. Remember, for the UPSC exam, it's not just about knowing the facts.
Yeah.
You got to be able to connect the dots, think critically about different viewpoints, and come up with your own opinions, based on the information you have.
And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one shaping those policies, tackling these exact issues we've talked about.
If you found this deep dive helpful for your UPSC prep, do us a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with your fellow aspirants. Oh, and leave a comment. Let us know what you thought, what really stood out to you, or if you have any questions you just got to ask.
We love hearing from you guys. Until next time, keep learning, keep those questions coming, and keep aiming for the top.